Welcome to the selected ones. When a chosen one shuts you off, it is not a tantrum. This is a spiritual eviction notice. And once the door is closed, even heaven will not reopen it without approval. Let it sink in. Because when a chosen one goes away, it is not petty, but prophetic. You could suppose they just pressed the block button and went on. Oh no, baby. They vanished, taking your calm, safety, and final bit of sanity. This is a disturbing reality. According to studies, toxic people suffer withdrawal symptoms, which are true psychological discomfort, when their source of emotional supply disappears unexpectedly. Consider the effect if the supply was handpicked and provided from the divine. So you assumed they had left the group chat? No, they walked out of the flames. You continued faking. Wasn't burning. They took the oxygen with them, and now everyone has departed. Is gasping and gossiping. That was not drama. That was deliverance. So, grab your tea, popcorn, or sage stick. Whatever helps you survive. Because we're going to discuss why your cutoff game has folks falling back as if they saw a ghost, and how walking away isn't a sign of weakness. It was war. Let's get to it. Number 1, you did not walk away. You have spiritually banished them. You didn't just walk away. You did not just leave them alone or take a break. You went far deeper. You have spiritually banished them. You denied them access to your energy, light, and emotional refuge. They didn't even see it coming. It struck them with a power they couldn't describe since they had never prepared for the day. You'd become weary of being drained, and you'd go without slamming the door. You did not need to. You just vanished from the battlefield, and the quiet resonated louder than the tumult. They attempted to keep you confined inside. They suspected you were hooked to their drama. They assumed you'd never go because you were always the mediator, the forgiving, the strong one who kept things together. But they didn't understand you were quietly gathering your power piece by piece. You were waking up wiser and more aware of how much of your soul they were carelessly squandering. And once you recognized it for what it was, manipulation wrapped in fake concern, guilt traps dressed as love, you had no option but to cut them off precisely. They didn't anticipate that. They were anticipating a fight, a breakdown, or another effort to mend something that was never your responsibility. But you did not offer them that. You gave them exactly what they couldn't handle. Your absence. You withdrew your light. You have banned the access point. They used to recharge your item by giving you tension in exchange. You were not being chilly. You were being clear. You did not depart out of anger. You left out the clarification. You recognized they were spiritual squatters, and you had every right to remove them from a location. They never honored your presence. And they're not simply angry anymore. You left. They are disturbed by the fact that you have never looked back. Number 2, they mistook your tranquility for passivity. They're plagued by your absence. They misunderstood your peacefulness for weakness. They assumed that since you weren't applauding back, screaming, or matching their mayhem, you were frightened to speak up for yourself. However, your quiet was a sign of progress rather than fear. You were choosing rationality over drama. You were practicing emotional self-control while they were attempting to pull you into emotional quicksand. Now that you've left, they don't only miss you. They are disturbed by what your absence reveals about them. You weren't just another individual in their lives. You were the calming presence amid their turmoil. You were the one who held things together while everything else around them fell apart. They didn't recognize it until you stopped replying or showing up, until you stopped performing the implicit role of their emotional support system, and they returned nothing but perplexity. And now that you've left, they can't sleep well. Not because they missed the vibe, but because they are forced to confront themselves without your energy to protect them from their dysfunction. They don't miss their connection. They miss the control. They miss the fact that they could press your buttons while still having access to you. Now they're rereading messages, overthinking previous discussions, and attempting to figure out how someone they misjudged slid right out of their hands without notice. You were the glue. You were the grounding force. They didn't notice that when they had you. And now that your peace is gone, the cacophony in their lives is louder than ever. They realized that your presence did more than simply soothe them. It sheltered them from aspects of themselves that they were not ready to confront. You acted as a barrier between their terrible judgments and the true repercussions. Now that you've left, they're stuck in the disaster they made, which is eating them alive. Number 3, your leaving did not only surprise them. It ruined their illusion of control. They believed they had influence over you. They really felt they could push you to your limits and drain your emotions. Then they used guilt, deception, or feigned concern to get you back in. They became comfortable playing mind games because you never gave up. You continued turning up, taking risks, and attempting to comprehend their behavior. But they had no idea that while they were playing games, you were observing everything. You were taking mental notes. You were monitoring the patterns, identifying the manipulation, and slowly withdrawing from the version of yourself who cared enough to remain. So your decision to walk away was not impulsive. It was not emotional. It was calculated. It was a tidy, purposeful cut based on what they assumed you didn't notice. That is what startled them. That was what rocked them to the core. Because, in their minds, you were still trapped, uncertain, and emotionally attached to the drama they produced. However, when you went, it was not a farewell. That was a statement. You did not just terminate the connection, friendship, or family dynamic. You demolished the idea that they had influence over your choices. They are now scurrying, not simply because you're gone, but because they understand they never had any authority. It was all borrowed. Everything depends on your willingness to give them the benefit of the doubt. When you stopped doing it, their impact dwindled. The whole charade went apart. They can't accept the fact that you went without seeking closure, proclaiming it, or asking to be understood. Someone who felt they had you on a string may find that amount of detachment scary. The fact is that you were not under their control. You were under pressure. And when you realized the reality about the arrangement, how it was all based on deception and control, you didn't simply leave. You revealed the whole organization for what it was. And the instant you did, everything came crumbling down around them. And then your cutoff was not called. It was a deliberate spiritual survival. You were not being heartless. You weren't attempting to make a statement or get them to pursue you. You weren't searching for vengeance. You were striving to survive. Plain and straightforward. You glanced around to see how their presence was affecting you. Your mental clarity, emotional stability, and feeling of calm. And you understood that being linked to them was slowly murdering bits of you. That took years to construct. It was no longer simply tension. It was spiritual suffocation. You did not cut them off out of anger. You did it because you were spiritually endangered. Every chat exhausted you. Every contact pushed you further into uncertainty. Every time you attempted to explain yourself, you felt more misunderstood and emotionally weary. It got to the point where you had to stand back and wonder, is my soul safe here? And the response was no. So you did what you had to do, not to harm others, but to protect yourself. This was not chilly. This was done deliberately. You did not respond. You answered wisely. You looked at the energy exchange and saw you were doing all the giving while they were receiving, draining, and feeding off your compassion as if it was limitless. But you knew better. You recognized that your soul is a temple, not a dump, for other people's unresolved suffering. When they couldn't keep that promise, you took the difficult decision to walk away, preserve your light, and recover your authority. Some will describe it as uncaring. Let them. They have no idea how it feels to be spiritually attacked and emotionally worn down by individuals who grin in your face while draining you behind closed doors. You realized how much it was costing you to remain, and you refused to continue paying that price. So no, you were not chilly. You were brave enough to choose spiritual survival above emotional enslavement. And there's no need to apologize for that choice. Number 5, they thrived on the attention you didn't realize you were providing. You had no clue how much they relied on your energy. Not your money or time, but your presence. Your attention was their lifeline. Simply being near you made them feel important, relevant, and powerful. You were their emotional charger, and they were always connected into you without asking for permission. Every time you exhibited compassion, listened to their issues, or gave them the benefit of the doubt, they felt validated, not because they admired you, but because they craved the reflection of themselves in your light. You were feeding them without realizing it, and in an unhealthy manner. They were not attempting to expand. They were attempting to live on the strength they saw in you. They emulated your language, your healing, and even attempted to absorb your work as if it were transferable. But it wasn't. They were not motivated to develop. They were content to circle you like a satellite, relying on your gravity for survival while doing nothing to develop their own. And when you disconnected, you stopped responding, explaining, and checking in. It was like turning off the electricity in a home full of gadgets. Everything went black. You didn't just depart. You demonstrated how phony their confidence was when you weren't around to support it. That's what really struck them. Your silence was not what shattered them. It was the awareness that they could not shine without the light of others. They are now rotating, not because they miss you, but because they are unable to function without your vitality. They're agitated, perplexed, and maybe enraged. But in reality, they are cut off from their hidden source. You weren't simply someone in their lives. You were the unsaid source that helped them feel whole. They never dreamed you'd have the fortitude to disconnect, but you did. And now all they have is an echo of all they used to feed on, but never appreciated. Number 6. You're going away vulnerable. Who was really starved spiritually? When you went away, something changed. Not only for you, also for them. You weren't simply standing back to collect your breath or make a point. You were taking away your energy, intelligence, and spiritual grounding from others who were covertly surviving on it. As soon as it occurred, the truth out. They were hungry the whole time. You couldn't see it clearly because you were feeding them. You were the one who made place for them. The one who anchors the room and keeps things balanced while everything else around them is coming apart. However, they took your presence for granted. They assumed your tranquility was a personality feature rather than a spiritual gift. They expected you'd always be there to hold the line. But when you stepped back, their inner turmoil had nothing to rely on, and it became clear that they required your light to feel normal. You were not intending to expose anybody. You were attempting to heal. However, this highlighted their dependence. You were the lighthouse, silently protecting things from sinking while others branded you too sensitive, too deep, or too much. However, when your light went out, they were much than simply unpleasant. They were lost. That's because your presence was never limited to emotional support. It was a spiritual covering. Without you, they are forced to confront what you inadvertently saved them from, their own emptiness. You absorbed their storms. You filled up the spiritual holes. You were the soul that people relied on without ever expressing thank you. And now that you've left, they're not completely alone. They've been exposed, not because you humiliated them, but because your absence dispelled the illusion. They believed they were whole until your light ceased shining on them. They're now left with quiet, the actual sort, the type that echoes, the sort that confronts them with the facts. That without you, they must confront themselves, and they're hungry for something they never nurtured. They produce their own light. Number 7. Your limits were a mirror that reflected their dysfunction. You were not being tough. You were not attempting to manipulate anybody. All you did was draw a clear, solid, spiritual line and declare, "This is where I end, and you can't violate me anymore." That border was not an assault. It was a proclamation of self-respect. But when you enforced it, something unexpected occurred. They didn't simply get defensive. They were exposed since the barrier wasn't only a protection for you. It was a mirror for them. When you stopped allowing the emotional games, backhanded compliments, and guilt trips disguised as love, they were forced to admit how unhealthy their conduct was. Instead of embracing it, they attempted to change the narrative. You were suddenly overreacting, oversensitive, or behaving strangely. But in reality, they were just uncomfortable looking at themselves without your continual grace to cushion the impact. You did not change. You've simply stopped shrinking. You stopped walking on eggshells to protect yourself from individuals who were not afraid to tread on you. You gave up expressing yourself to individuals who were determined to misunderstand you. And that quiet, strength, and unwillingness to yield. It shook them not because you were incorrect, but because you were correct. And your rightness exposed their wrongness in ways they couldn't refute. You were the mirror they couldn't escape, and it horrified them because your limits said, "I'm no longer available for this function, even if it is familiar." That meant they had to make a choice, develop or be left behind, and the majority of them were not prepared. They were not upset that you had standards. They were angry. Those criteria reflected how much mending they had still to undertake. Your boundary was not rejection. It was a revelation. When you stopped cushioning the effect of their brokenness, it revealed who they really were. Instead of striving to fulfill your standards, they decided to condemn you for having them. But it is not your weight to bear. That is their mirror to confront. Number 8. You did not avoid drama. You disabled their access to pandemonium. You did not just walk away from drama. You disarmed it. You saw the patterns, the cycles of mayhem, the phony apologies, the purposeful quiet, and the unexpected tenderness after fight. It was not arbitrary. It was a system, and you were the battery. Every time you replied to rudeness, attempted to explain yourself, or sought quiet in uncertainty, you were feeding their control. And one day you woke up and realized there is no conflict. This is a trap. They weren't attempting to have a discussion. They were luring you into reacting. Each parameter was a setup. Every guilt trip served as a rope to bind you more tightly. They were analyzing your replies like a playbook, testing your limits, and altering their strategies to keep you emotionally on edge. They understood precisely how to drive you over the edge, then reel you back in with just enough sympathy or pity to keep you hopeful they'd change. That was not love. That was emotional chess. You finally flipped the board. You did not avoid the drama. You disconnected from the frequency. You became unpredictable. You stopped explaining yourself, responding, and giving them the benefit of your energy. It was like ripping the wiring from a machine. Glitch in mid-air operations. The manipulation abruptly ceased functioning. The confusion became louder. The tactics failed because the version of you they were playing did not exist anymore. And it was not easy. You had to let go of the need to defend yourself, be understood, and repair things one more time. But you knew the truth. They were not attempting to settle anything. They were attempting to recycle your suffering. And when you turned off that loop, everything crumbled. They no longer have access to the mayhem they previously controlled. You didn't just leave them behind. You rendered their system impotent. And there was the true menace. Because, without your energy to feed the lunacy, they were forced to sit in quiet with their own dysfunction. For the first time, you were not there to save them. Number 9, they wanted you there, but not completely. So you departed with all of your pieces. They never desired the real you. They wanted a version that they could manage. A shattered, worn-down form that is susceptible to their will. They wanted your time, energy, and sympathy, but not your whole presence. They did not want you entire. They wanted you to be damaged enough to keep coming back for more, but not so strong that you'd walk away. But you saw through it. You saw that their affection was transactional, conditional, and empty. It was not about creating a life or a relationship together. It was about stealing bits of you, your tolerance, compassion, and self-worth, until there was just a shell left to control. And whenever they attempted to condemn you for being too much, too sensitive, or not enough, you seized that aspect of yourself rather than retreating. So, when you went away, you didn't leave behind any parts. They intended to steal. You collected everything. They attempted to quiet or minimize. You did not lose yourself in their pandemonium. You came up completely intact, unapologetic, and unshaken. That level of self-awareness is difficult to achieve and uncommon. That's why it shook them so badly. They were used to stealing pieces of you without consequences. But you refused to be broken any longer. You left entire, and the reality struck harder than any debate or confrontation could. It wasn't only your departure. They believed it was the force of your totality. You reminded them that you are not a collection of bits to be disassembled. You are a complicated, resilient person who deserves to be respected. And that understanding rocked them to their heart because it meant the game was ended. You weren't theirs to break. You were yours, and you left with everything that earned you the number 10 spot. They didn't expect you to develop. They expected you to persevere. They always relied on you to be the steady constant, the one who bends, accepts responsibility, and cleans up the mess. Their whole system was based on your endurance. They wanted you to remain the same, caught in the same cycles, calmly absorbing the turbulence and never upsetting the balance. They saw your job as predictable: endure, excuse, explain, forgive, repeat. They were not asking for expansion. They demanded obedience. However, you surprised them. You didn't just survive. You developed. You've learned where to draw lines. You knew when to speak out and when to go away. You identified patterns rather than becoming lost in them. Your development was not loud or showy. It was calm, steady, and unrelenting. You did not just modify your responses. You altered your expectations of yourself and of others. This transformation took away their privilege. It dispelled their belief that you were there to repair things while they remained the same. They suddenly lost control. The safety net they had depended on evaporated when you ceased being the punching bag, emotional worker, or fixer-upper. You ceased being their emotional default. That change terrified them. It was not only that you changed. It was that their whole identity, based on your perseverance, no longer functioned. They lost their position in your fiction when you changed the rules. They were not prepared for it. They wanted the old you, the one who never asked, demanded, or walked away. However, growth does not involve waiting for permission. It's about breaking away from outdated assumptions. And by changing, you demonstrated that perseverance is not a life sentence. It's time to conclude this chapter. You didn't just outgrow the drama. You outgrew their preconceptions about you. That's why your development was the most devastating cutoff of all. A number. You did not just exit the room. You carried the atmosphere with you. You weren't simply another individual in the room. You were the force that kept everything together. You were the calm in the storm, the voice that cut through the noise, the presence that provided clarity when everything else was out of control. When you went away, you were abandoning more than just your body. The whole mood shifted. You carried peace and balance. You initiated the order. You insisted that they did not just disappear. It created a void that cannot be ignored. Now the area you occupied feels empty. And it isn't only because you've left. It's because the energy that kept everything stable disappeared with you. They're caught in quiet. However, it is not the tranquil sort. It's weighty, awkward, and filled with the lack of what you brought. The talks are off, the feelings are raw, and the peace you created is nowhere to be found. It's as if the room has lost its anchor, and everything is floating, unsure, and vulnerable. That change is more than a coincidence. It demonstrates that you were not merely a part of the surroundings. You were the environment. Your presence provided an environment in which individuals could feel secure, heard, and balanced. When that container cracked, the flaws in everyone's character and connections emerged, revealing their actual colors and making the veneer they hid behind more difficult to maintain. They may not express it aloud, but they feel it every day. The weight of the hole you left behind serves as a continual reminder that what you offered was not just surface level. You were the atmosphere. And now that you've taken it with you, they're forced to confront what remains after the quiet fades. Their unvarnished and censored reflection. A number. You did not just exit a relationship. You ended a generational curse. You did not just walk away from a relationship. You disrupted a cycle that was far larger than both of you. This was about more than simply one person's shortcomings or the poison of a circumstance. It was about a deeper pattern, a trauma that persisted throughout generations, like a broken record. When you opted to go, you weren't just exiting someone's life. You were shutting a psychic gateway that had been open for decades, maybe millennia. The pattern you disrupted was not visible to everyone, but it existed. It is passed down via scars disguised as family traditions, poisonous beliefs, and unhealed anguish. You inherited it as an unwelcome heirloom, a chain of dysfunction that no one wanted to discuss. However, everyone lived underground, and by walking away, you declined to add another connection. You refused to become a receptacle for the same old turmoil. Your severance wasn't simply personal. It was cosmic. It sent shockwaves across the unseen threads that bind the past, present, and future. It served as a proclamation that the cycle had come to an end. You weren't just defending yourself. You were safeguarding future generations by detaching as a spiritual act of liberty, one that untangles the knots of trauma and prevents the transfer of suffering. That's why your leave seemed so dramatic, so seismic. It wasn't simply about drama or distance. Few people realize how profound the transition was. You did not just exit a relationship. You ended a lifetime of hereditary agony. And that type of daring disturbs the roots of family trees, rewrites destiny, and paves the way for healing where there was previously just repetition. You aren't simply going away. You are breaking the curse. And that truth is both strong and uncommon. A number. They labeled you callous because you stopped pretending to be the savior. You were not heartless. You were fatigued. For so long, you bore the brunt of everyone else's misery, continually intervening to solve what wasn't your responsibility. You tolerated blunders that should have served as lessons. You become the emotional crutch for those who were too fearful or hesitant to speak up for themselves. However, the job gradually wore you down to the point where you had nothing more to offer. And that's when you took the difficult decision to cease being the rescuer. When you ultimately refused to sacrifice yourself on their altar of brokenness, the narrative shifted. Suddenly, you were cold, cruel, and selfish. The folks you carried couldn't handle it. You stopped carrying them. They didn't recognize your heroism in defending your spirit. They just noticed the lack of their continuous rescue. However, mending is not about becoming the hero in someone else's tale. It's about regaining yours. And villains do not recover. You were not the villain. You were a survivor. You were the one who stepped into real-time recovery while others remained trapped in cycles of misery and dependence. Calling you heartless was their coping method. It was simpler to make you a monster than to address their own need to develop, accept responsibility, or confront their brokenness. But you refused to play the game. You prioritized your completeness before their comfort. And that decision will always seem callous to others who rely on your suffering. You did not cease caring. You began caring for yourself. And it is the most radical, revolutionary action of all. Number, you weren't simply keeping your peace. You were protecting the heavenly task. You weren't just keeping your peace. You were protecting a heavenly duty. The choice to pull back or take a break was not made casually. It was a mission-critical relocation with a greater purpose. Chaos and drama are incapable of consuming the clarity, concentration, and energy required for your purpose. When you went away, it was not because of personal sentiments or minor disagreements. It was really about spiritual warfare. Every distraction you eliminated was not only a loss for them, it was an advancement for you. Each cutoff was a calculated decision to preserve your destiny and maintain your road clean. They couldn't appreciate the discipline required to put your bigger mission above current drama because they weren't tuned into your frequency. This degree of devotion, this type of walk away, rocks the very foundations of what people expect of you. That's why it bothered them. Your choice was not selfish. It was sacrosanct. You realized that in order to complete your divine mission, you needed to defend your energy fiercely and refuse to allow turmoil impede your development. The fights you fight are not always apparent, but they exist. Your walk away was a proclamation. Your goal comes first, and nothing will keep you from doing what you were meant to accomplish. At the end of the day, your termination was not a sign of weakness, bitterness, or flight. It was a powerful assertion of survival, progress, and self-esteem. You did not just walk away from pandemonium. You deconstructed the mechanisms that kept you trapped in cycles of pain and dysfunction. Every barrier you established, every step back you made, and every moment of solitude you enjoyed was not intended to exclude others. It was about stopping the drain on your spirit so you could breathe, heal, and grow. Understand this. Walking away with all of your pieces intact, choosing growth over endurance while shattering generational curses is nothing short of revolutionary. It rewrites tales that were never intended for you, and it questions the expectations of people who benefited from your contribution. Your amputation shattered the foundations of not just your world, but also theirs. It compelled them to face their own shadows, dependence, and brokenness in ways that no argument or explanation could. You did not go because you were cold or uncaring. You left because you finally saw the value of your own soul. And in doing so, you establish a new norm for not just how others treat you, but also how you treat yourself. This is the power of your cutoff. It's a boundary that promotes clarity, a declaration that demands respect, and healing that extends beyond your own life. So, like Arma, don't regret your choice and embrace the quiet that comes after the storm. Remember that every stride away from the noise and commotion is a step closer to your genuine self, which is stronger, wiser, and unashamedly entire. Your cutoff strategy did more than simply cause them to back off. It propelled you to new heights, which are unstoppable. If this message appealed to you, if you believe in the power of reclaiming your voice and rewriting your narrative, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe now to ensure that you never miss out on the genuine discussion and profound truths that are headed your way. I like this video. If this connects with your path, please leave a comment to share your story or views. Your opinion matters here. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, please share it with them. Together, we will rise stronger, clearer, and more unstoppable than ever. Let us keep this movement alive.